are talking Robot Apocalypse. This one is directed by Joe Roche and is produced by the Asylum, of course, known for mainly cranking out megalo mockbusters. This one is kind of a Terminator-esque style film and stars Tito Ortiz, UFC fighter, although he is billed as the kind of the starring role, but he doesn't show up until about halfway through and then he's kind of out the movie again 10 minutes later. Instead you get a plethora of other kind of actors that you would have seen in other Asylum and kind of low budget B-movie flicks. So what is the story? Well, as you can probably tell by the Terminator comparison, it features an AI which becomes self-aware and decides it's going to try and take over the world's military by hacking into various kind of systems and taking over a variety of drones, these newly developed kind of soldier robots and a huge, great big kind of rescue robot as well. All the meantime, we have a small group of kind of researchers and scientist types who are trying to fight back and stop this robotic menace from destroying the Earth. So there you go. That is your basic plot premise. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the Asylum, as I've alluded to, it is somewhat kind of well known in B-movie circles as knocking out very cheap and cheerful movies, and this one is no real exception. It is a cheap and cheerful movie, but what can we talk about in the positive column? What works in this film? Okay, so I think the CGI, because we have robots rather than kind of living creatures, dinosaurs or monsters or things like that, I think you can kind of get away a little bit easier with some of the kind of the lower budget CGI. It doesn't look quite as bad. In fact, there are some sequences, in particular the kind of the large robots that we kind of see towards the end of the movie, I think actually is of a reasonable standard for a, for a B movie. We're not talking, blockbuster Marvel style kind of CGI here, but for a B movie, I didn't think the CGI for the most part was all that bad. And to be fair, there's not loads of CGI. The majority of what we get is kind of drones. But when we do see it, it's to a relatively good standard. I actually quite liked the switcheroo this movie does with kind of a main character sort of situation. I'm not going to say anything too much about it because I don't want to kind of go into spoilers, but nonetheless I thought it was quite interesting what it did with who you assume is going to be the kind of the main sort of character to a certain degree, and it kind of goes against the grain essentially in regards to who may make it out, who might not, and things like that. So that I thought was actually a little bit interesting. The acting is a mixed bag. There are some actors here that I think fare better than others, and the characters are a little broad. Let me just put it like this. We'll come on to it again. But there were some actors who I didn't think did a terrible job, especially with some of the hokey gobbledygook that people have to say in this film. I think they probably the best they could, to be honest with you. And the story is solid, for a kind of a low budget. Yes, it's a little silly and hokey, but it's okay for a kind of a B-movie kind of style film. What doesn't work, let me just go with the biggest problem first of all, and then we'll talk about some of the other things. The biggest problem with this movie, it is 70% people talking in rooms or poorly staged sets, talking a bunch of nonsense, to be honest. Asylum is a company that produces very cheap films, and as such, the expense of the CGI, the special effects, set pieces, explosions is kept to a bare minimum. So the runtime on these films are normally padded out with a hell of a lot of dialogue, where we have a close-up shot of two or more people in close proximity, so we don't have to worry about what's going on behind. And that is the case with this film. There is just a lot of talking with this kind of like computer screens in the kind of the background, thinking, I've got to hack into the mainframe and do this, that, and the other, and stuff like that. And it's kind of a lot of padding in this film. Don't be going into this film expecting much of an action film. There are a couple of sequences, but like I've said, the vast majority of the time is overinflated, kind of somewhat boring dialogue scenes with characters who are a little kind of like one-dimensional, to say the very least. Yeah, so the characters are pretty much, you know, stereotypical archetypes that you would expect to see in these type of films. You know, they're all like quote-unquote hackers. Amusingly, one's called Red Dragon, but sometimes she's referred to as Black Dragon, so they can't even kind of get the consistency right in some of the kind of the character names and things like this. And so there's a little bit of lack of attention to detail here. As I've mentioned, the positives, the acting is a mixed bag, and while some fare, I think, to a relatively good standard for a low-budget movie, there are those who do not. If you are watching this for a Tito Ortiz movie, as I say, you will be bitterly disappointed because he's in it about 10 minutes, just after that kind of the halfway mark, and doesn't really make much of an impact on the story, to be honest. And it is ultimately, although the story is, you know, it's a simple enough story. It's just kind of a story that we've seen plenty of times before. You know, the Terminator springs to mind initially. Things like the Marvel Age of Ultron. It's not anything good. These films barely ever are. But it's a fairly kind of simple plot that has a couple of like interesting moments here and there. How they end up defeating or kind of winning the day, you might say, to a point I think was interesting. But ultimately it's kind of a forgettable, quite frankly below average B movie. I think really hampered by probably a very short production time, lack of budget, and any real kind of scope. It's filled in with, there's stock footage of kind of like military and stuff like that, and there's just a lot of filler scenes here with dialogue and characters that seem to be making silly kind of sacrifices when they don't need to, and things like that for the cause of drama. I don't think it's particularly kind of terrible, really. It's just below average and pretty vanilla in a lot of ways. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.